Thank you all for coming here today. As I said earlier in some of our conversations, I'm pretty new in Sweden and I am very much learning about Swedish folk building, and I hope that during our discussion later on we will be able to explore some of the issues and questions that I will address in this first part, and I hope to learn very much from your experience and knowledge working in all the individual community colleges, as we try to translate in some instances folkhögskola, because that is something that is very valuable also to me to understand it from your perspective as those who have a lot of experience in practical work and also thinking about what folk building means. I'll try to keep this first part as brief as possible. So Michael initially told me to talk for about an hour, but I think it's too long. I'll try to keep it under an hour so that we have more time for discussion. This is basically what I'm going to give you in these first half an hour, 40 minutes, is an outline of a bigger project I'm working on, which concerns question of modernity and also Christian theology and Christian thinking as being formative in many ways for the whole question of modernity. And the reason why I'm starting in the first part with the question of modern time and modernity is simply because what we know as higher education, modern higher education, is a child of modernity and particularly the Enlightenment. So what I want to do is to explore a little bit some of the concepts that we find behind the modern university system, particularly European one. In the Anglo-Saxon world, it's a little bit different with its own issues, but I would like to focus more on the European one, and then in the second part reflect on how the Nordic model of folk building fits within this broader narrative about education, the role of education, particularly university education, in connection to modernity and modern society, and then finally what it means to do it from a Christian and a theological perspective. So this is the outline, so that if in some moments you start asking yourself, why am I paying so much attention and time on something that seems not to be directly related with folk building, this is the reason. I would like first to set the stage for discussing folk building within this broader context of education and modernity. So when we think about modernity, we can define it through a couple of main achievements of the whole Enlightenment project. And many authors have stressed three main characteristics. We can of course list many more, but three main characteristics of modernity which circulate around the idea of modern reason, that modern reason becomes something that we place in modernity as a central value and a central tool, or one of the central tools for our understanding of the world and our interaction with the world and society. And I insist here on a modern reason because it's not the first time in modernity that reason became utilized and advanced as an important concept. But modern reason has some more specific features, such as being more technologically oriented, more utilitarian in its application. And that's what we can find already from the early days of what we call modernity in the, let's say, post-Renaissance period. The second characteristic is, of course, secularization. And there is a lot of discussion about what secularization is, whether we have ever really been secular or not. But no matter how we understand the concept, even if we object to that concept, we cannot deny that in a certain sense, secularization and all the issues around secularization have played an important role in the formation of modernity and how we think of the modern world. And finally, we come across progress and progressivism as an ideology that is also closely attached to modernity. As we can see from already this outline, as I said, we can also list many more characteristics of modernity, but these arguably can be taken as core principles or core values that define our thinking about modernity. All three are closely related. Modern reason is closely related to secularization, to a new way of thinking things like church-state relations, thinking about the role of religious dogmas and faith within the society and for the whole project of modern knowledge and also university. And of course, both are related to the process of progression and progressivism and progress, because it is also one of the distinctly modern features that we believe that progress is possible and that we can change things, improve things, do things better than the way they were done before. That doesn't, of course, mean that people in the pre-modern times were not improving things, but it is very difficult to find faith in progress, a kind of consistent ideology that would sustain the idea that we can do things better. We very often find in the pre-modern times, even when you do something that's innovative, when you change things, that's being justified based on the principles of traditions or some older ways of doing it that we are trying to revive. But modernity actually inaugurated this principle that change is valuable in itself, legitimate in itself. We can change things and we don't need to justify them by, let's say, appealing to some older principles or older ways of doing things. Now, all this modernity, we can ask a question that seems to be a simple one, but of course is a very complicated one. How did all of this start? How modernity came to be? And of course, this is an extremely complicated thing, so I don't want even to give a kind of systematic, anything that would resemble a systematic answer to this question. But in a certain sense, one way to approach the question of modernity, and of course there are many authors who have done that by now, is that to think of modernity as something that begins with secularized Christian theology, with theologies that in a certain sense already became secular before even the period of modernity that we normally understand as something happening sometime between 16th century and later, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. So those theologies enabled us to think of the categories, those three categories that we then find as formative for the whole project of modernity. Some authors claim that actually late medieval period with scholasticism is something where we find already advancement of some of those categories that would become formative for the process of, for the project of modernity. Why scholasticism? Well, already in scholasticism we find, and especially in scholasticism and nominalism dispute, we find the advancement of the categories of human reason as means and criterion of knowledge of God and universal categories that were in some variations of scholasticism thought as being projections of God's ideas. and also our understanding of the world. Nominalism then, in a certain sense, took its step forward, introducing a kind of ultimately skeptical attitude toward the world as being something stable and something everlasting, but trying actually again to go back to the categories that we use to think of the world as our primary way in which we can deal with reality in the first place. And then if you really apply it systematically, then you realize you can never actually deal with the world. We just deal with our own categories. And this led, of course, and that is another big topic, to the rise of the modern understanding of the individual, and then later on modern subjectivity and so on. If we look at these processes already in the late medieval period, then we can see that what comes later on, and this history is a very complicated one to unpack here, that deistic ideas that come later on actually have their roots in those intellectual developments of the late Middle Ages, in actually trying to construct an ideological system in which slowly but surely God would be positioned as something that does not directly interact with the world, although in the early stages of modernity the existence of God wasn't, of course, questioned. This is also the context in which the Protestant Reformation happened, as a way to reclaim, if we look at it from this perspective, as a way to reclaim significance of faith, and a way to re-sacralize the world. So the call, sola fide, was a way, can be understood as a way to fight back the issues that came as a result of the scholasticist and nominalist discussions. The problem there, of course, is that the effect of the Protestant Reformation was even deeper secularization. How and why? What would that mean? Well, in the first sense, we have a strong accentuation of education and then research as a very fundamental ingredient of the Reformation project, which of course then gave its contribution to the rise and development of Western universities in general. There we have insistence of reason again as something that you wouldn't necessarily expect if the claim of going back to faith alone as a means of salvation would be advanced outside of this context of the intellectual environment in which Protestant Reformation actually happened. But if we keep this context, the broader environment in mind, then actually the advancement of reason in the context of secularization is also understandable. Then we have attack on the political role of the Roman Catholic Church. And the effect of that was, of course, that the role of secular rulers would become highlighted. So this is one of those probably undesired effects, but used effects of the Reformation, that the Reformation understood as a political project, and a broader ideology was used by political leaders to actually claim their independence from the church, at that time from the Roman Catholic Church, but then from the church and religion in general, which means that especially German princes initially were solidified in their roles as political leaders. And this, in effect, would also give rise to modern nation states. So this is, in a lot of steps that are not necessarily visible when we think of the Reformation or the first phases of the Reformation. On the surface, they're not necessarily visible, but they gave contribution to all of these three categories that I mentioned at the beginning. So the result of this was that the modern education and political powers became intertwined with the secular project and nation states and nation building. Education there was, of course, understood, and that's the Enlightenment project, as an emancipation project. Emancipation from superstition, emancipation from the slavery to church authorities, or nature for that matter, emancipation from ignorance, etc. So this would be a fundamental part of the Enlightenment project and how education and the role of education, university education, was envisioned. But secularization advanced, especially in the post-1648 period, when more and more the authority of religion was decreasing, and church institutions in general. And this is then applicable in the second part of the 17th century also to traditional Catholic countries, that even traditional Catholic rulers that you would expect to be allies of the Catholic Church started slowly to differentiate themselves from the Church and were becoming more and more secular rulers that would very explicitly deny their obedience to the Pope, and in some cases would go directly against Church and individual orders, such as, for example, the Jesuits, the famous case of their expulsion from many Catholic countries. This is also the time, the Enlightenment period, the formative period for what we call modernity, when there is the rise of university education, modern university education, parallel to the rise of absolute monarchies. When we look at documents from this period, we find the secular context as something taken almost for granted, where the leaders were supposed now, by the end of the 17th century, during the 18th century, more and more to promote and defend education as something that leads society to progress, that helps individuals to grow, or entire social classes, and less be advocates of particular doctrines of faith or particular religious institutions. And that is what we can see clearly among some of the enlightened autocrats, such as the case of Prussian rulers or even Austrian-Hungarian rulers. Education was understood as promotion of education as the duty of the monarch. And this education now would become primarily secularized education based on the values of reason and, of course, with the idea of progress in the background. The combination of this process, of course, and this model of the formation of modern university we find in Humboldt version of the university and the establishment of the University of Berlin, where university would become inaugurated as one of the key institutions of the modern society, modern state. And there, when you read Humboldt and you read what this concept was about, one part of that, of course, was promotion of what was called then liberal arts. So what we nowadays call the humanities, but also sciences. But what is interesting here, that it was also promotion of national identity in nation states. Modern university would become not just the institution where some abstract, objective knowledge would be produced, but became also an institution to educate good citizens, to solidify national identities, to promote, for example, national histories, and so on. this is quite an important development. Universities in this Enlightenment paradigm, and especially with later positivist developments in the 19th century, in many countries would become a place where we expect to find neutral research and truth happening. But the problem was that from the very beginning, those places were institutions of the state, paid by the state, very often directly or indirectly controlled by the state. In some countries, even professors appointed directly by the ruler, and contributing with the narrative produced within the university to the solidification of national identity and those states that were either formed by this time or were becoming modern nation states. So in a certain sense, university became places where knowledge is produced through research, but they also became places where, in a certain sense, there is truth, or the right over truth was monopolized. Universities became places where we have the institutional expression of the proper use of reason in search for truth. And of course, we have then a highly ideologized context, politically charged, socially charged, with all sorts of power games and power issues that go with that, but it's advertised as search for neutral and objective knowledge, and moreover, the state gives its stamp on this kind of research and education as being approved as truth and something objective. So this, of course, doesn't mean that the whole Enlightenment approach to education and the whole modern university system was not something that contributed a lot to all sorts of advancements. Modern science obviously gave all sorts of blessings that previous ages couldn't have even dreamed of. But that, of course, doesn't mean either that there were no significant problems with this understanding of the university as a place where truth is in a certain sense monopolized, and it's monopolized also by the state, as university became one of its major institutions. So one of the first problems there in the early period was that it was very elitist education. So universities were not places where most people would go. They became places where noble people go, where people who had the advantage of having free time and means to study could actually advance and develop their capacities for creativity, for thinking, all sorts of things. But it wasn't, of course, something that would apply to the general population. Second, education in universities became also places where state bureaucrats, state administration would be educated, and part of state administration were also teachers at lower levels, secondary or primary level. And those teachers were, of course, teachers in charge of creating good citizens, citizens who would be loyal to these states and official ideologies. Language teachers, history teachers, all sorts of other. And finally, we have economic dimension, which might seem as something that's not ideological per se, but actually has everything to do with ideology. Universities started to be factories for the production of all sorts of workforce that should feed the modern capitalist economy and its needs. In the domain, of course, of research, research was understood as advancements of knowledge and advancements of truth coming closer to truth. And state in Europe, in most European countries, was the one that provided the money for research. Researchers, professors, very often were state servants. And this model started to change only over the last couple of decades when the introduction of neoliberal academy, where more and more we have professors being servants of big businesses as opposed to states. Not so much in Europe still, but in other places much more. So just to recap this part, modern understanding of the connection between education, the use of reason and truth, or objective knowledge, resulted in the monopoly over the concept of objective truth that the university and the state, while the university was in charge of it, in making a disconnect between concepts of theory, truth, and objectivity, and what is known as subjectivity and practice. In many European countries, you have the idea that universities, because they have something to do with research and objective truth, are primarily theory-oriented, and that this theory should serve as a criterion for practice. So practice becomes something almost lower rated activity, and theory is something that provides the framework for practice, and of course then later on theory can reflect upon practice. This is of course very much Hegelian as a model. We also have the concept of objectivity being attached to the concept of description, that in university allegedly through research, both in hard sciences but also in the humanities, we just supposedly neutrally describe reality as it is, and it is not the place where creativity happens. Creativity has to do with other kinds of human capacities, but not primarily with reason and not primarily with objective truths. So we managed through the Enlightenment project and modernity to separate creativity, subjectivity, emotions, all sorts of a whole range of human capabilities from truth, objectivity, and supposedly neutral descriptions, saying, well, this is something that has to do with truth, the other things have something to do with our individual expressions, and they are not really very reliable. Who is in charge of the truth is the university, is objective research, and ultimately the modern state. Universities become places of knowledge generation, practice become something that implements this generated knowledge. And of course, we have knowledge from above, both in terms of social classes and in terms of its supposed the value that it produces, based on facts to be learned, and then also in university or school system to be created, versus knowledge from below and a creative effort. It is, of course, not difficult to see there how truth and knowledge become instrumental to power structures, and how, in a certain sense, the whole concept of truth could become totalitarian, which is precisely what happened then in the 20th century with a couple of typically modernist projects. Because let us not forget that, let's say, the Soviet Union and the project of Bolshevism was not some retrograde going back to some pre-modern world and pre-modern ideas. It was fundamentally modernist project. It was about modernization, and it was based and rooted in some elements of the Enlightenment. And it, of course, resulted in a totalitarian concept of truth, with certain institutions that have monopoly over what truth is and how it should be interpreted. This is where we then have the concept of education and interhuman generation of knowledge as being related to folk building. An alternative way of approaching not only how we do education in terms of pedagogical practices, but also as something that can be understood as a different approach to the world, can be understood, I would say, even as different epistemology. An epistemology that is, I think, more serious than the epistemology that has been traditionally applied to this kind of university understanding that I described before. We can discuss this more. I can go into detail why I think that claims to objective knowledge and this monopoly of truth is questionable and is epistemologically inconsistent. In folk building, we find, or we can find if we want to, understanding of knowledge as something that has to do with emancipation, but has to do with emancipation of people across social strata, across social classes. We have a context in which personal experiences and creativity is not divorced from truth, is not divorced from learning, but is part of learning. And in that sense is not something to be understood as a imperfect way of doing knowledge, or something that is still not at the level of theory, but I would say that in a certain sense is a better theory than the theory that pretends to be neutral and objective, and which excludes personal experiences. We have also the understanding, or if we are careful enough, we can derive this understanding from practice of folk building, that truth is something that comes through an interaction, something that is being constituted through creative practices. All of this is, I think, closely related, or we can closely relate it to Christian theology and Christian understanding of who the human being is. Not, of course, for the purposes, as Michael said at the beginning, of monopolizing folk building, or saying, well, there is the Christian way to do it, but saying this model, this kind of pedagogical practice, this understanding of knowledge is something that is compatible with Christian anthropology. How? Well, one of the fundamental principles, I think, in Christian anthropology, if it wants to be serious, is that human being is a mystery. Not only that the world is a mystery, or that God is a mystery, but the human being is a mystery. If the human being is a mystery, then we can never accept that a human being can completely be reduced to abstract categories of our reason, and of course can never be utilized for any purposes, including the most noble ones. So we have a refusal to accept that the entirety of reality, or human being for that matter, can be put in conceptual definitions, can be codified, and so on, and instrumentalized in the end. This is what we could call an epiphatic approach from a Christian theological perspective. And I think that epiphatic theology is actually the only theological method that's uniquely theological.
Do you say empathetic?
Epiphatic. The refusal to express truths of Christian faith in positive phrases, positive formulations.
How does it spell? I need it for the understanding.
I'll write it. So,
And please describe it again. What does it mean?
Yeah. So it's a tradition that we can find from the very early period. I mean, actually, you can find it already in the New Testament. Elaborated later on, but mostly associated with one author called Dionysius, the Areopagite, where theological method, it's sometimes called negative theology. Probably that's very familiar.
So is it the same as negative theology?
It can be the same, but I would claim that some of those things that are called negative theology, I would not count them, strictly speaking, as what seems to me to be the core of apophatic theology. And I don't like the negative part because it almost seems as something, there is a positive as something valuable and negative as something not. But the idea with negative is to say we are not positively describing, for example, how do we talk about God? Some of these authors will just say whatever you say about God, it will be false.
Yes.
So, because even if you say good, it doesn't mean anything. We are still applying our concepts and on something that's utterly different reality and cannot be grasped by those concepts. In a certain sense, we are, now it would be using modern language or interpretation of apophatic method, we are ideologizing the reality of God, something that cannot be used for any particular purposes, something that cannot be contained within categories of our reason. So we refuse, actually, which ultimately leads to this silence or mystery, keeping mysteries of faith as mysteries of faith instead of trying to simplistically put them in certain categories of our reason. So this theological method developed as a way of speaking, or rather not speaking, refusing to speak in positive terms about God, but it can be applied also to the human being, because if we approach the human being as something that's an image of God, and then you can elaborate what it means, but whatever it means, if it's an image of God, it's an image of God precisely in this sense, or in this sense, in addition to everything else, being a mystery, being something that is not completely revealed, that is not completely knowable to us. Not only because we lack in this moment certain knowledge, scientific knowledge to decode it, but is unknowable in principle. Because if we could know everything about the human being, that would already be an object that's presented in front of us for our reason, and according to the modern paradigm, it would also be something to be utilized and be ultimately manipulated with. So the mystery of keeping the mystery of the human being means, if you will, the protection of the dignity of the human being. Saying we don't know who the human being is, because that is something that will be revealed to us in the end of history. Just as we will know God in the end of history. And this knowledge, of course, but that would lead us into a totally different discussion. This knowledge, also knowledge, Christian knowledge of God, is not knowledge about God, just as it is not knowledge about human being. It is acquiring the way of knowing in which God knows the world. So, and that is a very different matter from positivistic or scientific or enlightenment idea of what education is or what conceptual categories are. So the point here is simply to say that by refusing to submit to a positivistic, instrumental, modern rationalized method of dealing with reality of a human being, we can find, or we can derive from Folkbildning, we can actually put it in parallel with Christian anthropology, with a lot what we already find in Christian heritage. Why is this important? Well, first of all, it is as I said, refusal to accept that the entirety of reality and human reality of who the human being, human person is, can be put in simple definitions and codified. Second, we also, through this approach to education and knowing and pedagogical practices, we express something beyond fixed concepts as instruments of power. Because you remember the first part of the story, fixed concepts, objectivity, truth, as something that we can reach and manipulate, is never neutral. It always happens within an ideological framework, socio-political reality, where this understanding of objective truths is being manipulated to sustain and expand, more often than not, power structures. So preventing fixed and oppressive concepts that can end up in totalitarian version of truth and totalitarian version of society, preventing those fixed and oppressive concepts has a potential to be subversive vis-a-vis power structure, to prevent power structures from being formed or being expanded, at least. And finally, we have an understanding of truth as a different, in a different paradigm, through a paradigm shift. Truth as a result of a creative effort, which means rejection of the concept of truth as a pre-given objective reality. This might seem as a small change of perspective, but it actually has tremendous consequences. And I think Christian approach is precisely the one which says we actually don't know what truth is. We don't know what Christian truth is. Because if we knew that, then we wouldn't have any need of the eschatology, of the second coming of Christ, of the kingdom of God, none of this. We wouldn't have need of this fatty matter and so on. You don't need to approach it from a Christian perspective. I think even if you approach it from what I would call, for the purposes of this presentation, the epistemology of Folkbildning, even if it's not Christian, you have a concept which says, well, truth and knowledge that we are getting to through educational practices is not predetermined. It is something, truth is something that happens through a creative process. And that's a very different approach to the concept of truth, and I would say reality, from what typically modernist education paradigm would like us to believe. That there is objective truth buried somewhere in our reality, and all we need to do is just to objectively look at it and get to this truth, and once we get to the truth, we know it, and we can do with it whatever we want. It is, first of all, naive epistemology, so it can be criticized on that level, but more importantly, it actually is, in its structure, pretty totalitarian, because it says there is just one truth out there, and we have methods to derive that truth, and once we do it, then we have monopoly over the truth. We know what the truth is, what a human being is, what nature is, and so on. Is that not precisely in the very heart of all modern totalitarian projects? Saying we know the truth, and now we should do something based on this knowledge of truth. And this truth is not a result of a creative effort. It is not something that generated through us coming together, but it is something that objectively exists, and there are instruments and ways to claim knowledge of this objectively existing truth. This also means, so this paradigm, that we can think within the framework of Folkbildning about why we think what we think. We can we already have methodologies for critical deconstruction of ideology. What it means to have this or that, to be this or that. What does it mean for our condition in the world? Not pretending that our condition in the world is something, our condition of us individuals, that it's something subjective and not relevant for what happens in the world. It becomes very relevant, it becomes constitutive of the truth of the world, if you want to put it that way. Research in this context, approaching and doing research with this understanding of categories of truth and knowledge, would then happen at the boundary of any discourse, of any system of ideas, where thinking in abstract concepts meets creative practices. Not as something that's fundamentally different or something that we contrast to each other, but it's something that actually is part of one and the same story. To that effect, we can question the boundaries of our existence, human existence, individual existence, or social existence. We can create the meaning, not simply pretend that we discover objectively existing truths, or that we learn from what is already being codified as a system of ideas and a system of meaning. And all of this is very difficult to capture if we approach education and knowledge from the perspective of traditional research schools and traditional or modernist paradigm. In my understanding, and it would be very important to hear your perspective here, Folkbildning is about participation in the generation of knowledge. It involves the human being in a very fundamental sense, instead of pretending to be apersonal and objective, while it necessarily speaks to various ideological goals and various power structures. So I would stop here to just keep the promise that I would talk a little bit less than an hour. Thank you, but I would be happy to hear your comments and perspectives and critiques of any of this. It seems to me, and you all know more than I know about what folkbildning is and how it evolved in Northern Europe. It seems to me, from what I've learned so far, that there are also in Nordic countries different understandings of what folkbildning is. So if I talk to a couple of different people who do that from different schools, and each one of them tells a little bit different story about what folkbildning is, depending, I suppose, on his or her practice and personal experience, and whether it's almond push or primarily what they do, or whether it's something else, whether it's attached to the church or not. It seems to me that based on that, how we understand what it means, what the core of folkbildning is, then we can say, well, it is practiced also elsewhere, maybe it's not called that way, or not. I mean, if we keep strictly to kind of institutional framework in which that happens, it is pretty unique to Nordic Europe. But I would say that in many other contexts, in some cases, actually, many of those practices that here would happen typically in folk school could be part of the university as well. Education. So it wouldn't necessarily be something separate. In some countries, it is this distinction that I try to insist more on, that is not that clear in some other parts of Europe or some other parts of the world, between university and insistence on theory and knowledge and objectivity and something else that would be creative practices. I would say that in Northern Europe and in other countries such as Germany, this distinction seems to be pretty clear, up to the point that even some creative practices, traditionally, or let's say visual arts schools, traditionally were not part of the university education, such as in Germany. And this has to do, I think, with this idea, what the university education is, what is its place within society, and what are alternative forms of education. In some other contexts, this distinction just would be much more blurred, and then you could have a lot of these personal experiences being brought into the classroom, and professional experiences as a vital part of the learning process, where you don't necessarily try to achieve predetermined goals, but it is much more open-ended. But I think more or less for the Western world, at least when it comes to the historical development, we can always discern this official pattern and official education, which has to do with supposedly objectivity, and then other practices that are more or less related to this one. And I think it just has to do with this typically enlightened idea of what knowledge is, what the role of reason is, and what is, let's say, creativity or artistic practices or everything else. Because the problem is that in a certain sense, the reason, modern reason, started to monopolize the concept of truth. And that was translated into objectivity, and I think that is a very problematical part, and one of the most difficult things that we come across in the whole modern project, without negating, of course, many emancipatory elements that went together with it. But the problem was that in a certain sense, those emancipation elements that were built into the very system of the Enlightenment became hijacked by new social classes or new developments over the course of modernity, especially during the late 18th and during the 19th century. It probably will be a short answer, because my way of putting it would be, if we knew what creativity precisely means, just as freedom, it would cease to be creativity and it would cease to be freedom. My way of putting it would be that creativity for me means, and that's why I always link it to freedom, because I think it's just like two sides of the same thing. You cannot have creativity without freedom, and any manifestation of freedom is creative, and is creativity. It has to do with pushing the boundaries of whatever, any boundaries. Boundaries of our existence, boundaries of our social and political existence, boundaries of our thinking, boundaries of our the way we act, the way we understand things, the way we do things. So that would be for me creativity, and that's why I think it would be very fundamental not to think of the world as something that's populated by objective truths that we just through some neutral method discover, because I first of all think it's a fiction. It never works, it's never there. There's no reason to believe it. This just can be possibly possible. Second of all, we actually, that way, we, I think, stress much more our individual responsibility, because then you are the one who's also in charge of truth, of your own existence, of your social context, of knowledge and everything else. So you are not just the one who is in a passive position of just discovering truth or waiting for somebody else to tell me what truth is, but actually we become active subjects. Yes. Because I don't think that Christians actually can possibly have any kind of special goals that just wouldn't be universal human goals. Because ultimately what Christianity is about is becoming human being. Nothing else. But the thing is that we don't know what it means to become fully human being. And that needs to be created. And I like this idea. And of course, this is not something that one finds everywhere in Christian theology. Certainly not. But it is my approach, theological approach, that even when we think of the kingdom of God and eschatology, if you seriously think it through, you come to a conclusion that actually it would also be oppressive, it would also be non-Christian, if we were just invited as human beings or Christian to some predetermined kingdom of God where God decided everything, how it will be, and then we just enter there. I don't think that's Christian understanding of God or kingdom of God. Christian understanding, because ultimately we could say to this God and His kingdom, okay, how is that related to me? It would be another oppressive. It would be exactly what communists try to do and what liberals try to do, to create paradigms based on certain concepts, ideas, without actually including us. And I think serious Christian understanding of the kingdom of God is precisely something in which we participate, not something that's just passively sitting there and we passively are here and then we should relate somehow. No. The purpose of having it as an eschatological reality means literally that it still doesn't exist. So when we judge it from our time categories, it's not there. And that gives us the possibility to creatively respond to this call, to participate in creation, because only in that sense it can be paradise for us. Otherwise, if it's given to us, it's a hell. We already have that in history, so we don't need another hell which will take eternity to be there. Paradise can only be something where we creatively, in the creation of which we creatively participate, respond freely to it, and in that sense it becomes an open project. And I like the idea of open projects and this unfinished models, because I think that's one way to avoid being terribly prescriptive and ultimately at the end of the day force reality and other people to conform to certain dogmas, certain abstract ideas that just suppress who the human being is and suppress our creativity and our freedom. And that's how I understand the whole purpose of Christian theology and Christianity. I think you should say that to me. I shouldn't tell any of that to you. You know how to do that better than I. I think it would be one thing that I noticed when I talk to some people who are experienced in folkbildning. That sometimes I don't know if it's just an individual case or my impression, or is it something that you would also share. That there is almost a kind of inferiority complex sometimes when it comes to the university education or official education.
Inferiority complex.
Yeah.
Did you say that?
Yeah, like being inferior to the official system. That in many, as Michael said at the beginning, that in many ways it sometimes understood as catching up with people who don't have the formal education or missed something or come from a different background and do not really fit the system as it exists and so on and so forth. So that it in that sense helps them to kind of go back to the right track, so to speak.
Second chance.
Or second chance or something.
Or third or fourth.
Yeah, but my understanding is that that shouldn't be, or it doesn't need to be understood that way, because in a certain sense, what can be done within folklore school and framework is more valuable than what's done for most of the part within the official system. And in that sense, it can stand on its own and develop its own approach, not in opposition to the official system, but in a dialogue, actually helping the official system in a nice way, diplomatic way, understand how it's wrong about many things. Not helping just the system to kind of continue to be what it is, by preparing those students who do not fit or something to kind of go back there and somehow include me. Say, no. There is this method, there is this, but here there is another way of thinking about the learning process, a different way of understanding human knowledge and human place in the world. And there we can insist much more on communitarian aspect of who we are as human beings, some communitarian aspect of human knowledge, communitarian aspect of human creativity, communitarian aspect of human freedom. Because none of these categories really are the primary focus of the official education. Where it's more about you learn this, you replicate a certain field, you produce certain results, you are graded, there are all this, but the question, like, is this, how is that helpful? It's not obvious that system is helpful. And it becomes less and less obvious with all the knowledge that we accumulated in the meantime, where we know that many of those practices are actually directly counterproductive. Because I just can't see how it's helpful to the society or the world nowadays to force students to sit down, memorize certain books and facts, and then reproduce them, which very often is what it boils down to in official school systems. It's like you test them, you say that it doesn't see how is that, it's what it means. It's not a way to increase our understanding of anything. It's not a way to challenge people. It's not a way to develop their creativity. It's not a way to include them into a learning process. So I'm not advocating people should not memorize anything. So it's not about that. But it's about learning with the idea that we participate in the creation of knowledge. And it's not my role as a professor to be a fountain of wisdom there that will just tell all these wonderful truths, and then we need to, or somebody else, another stupid professor to, like, okay, this is what you need to reproduce. But actually, you, by the very fact that you're a human being, an inhabitant of this world, you have something that's valuable. And let's not diminish that through process of imposing knowledge and imposing so-called facts, and promote that as the only way to deal with truth and knowledge and something else. Well, I don't really, I mean, I understand when I think about it sociologically or politically or something, I understand why these boundaries are there, but I don't understand why they are there in the first place when we think about it theologically.
That's bold statement.
But
even if you were thinking from a conservative point of view, still in Folkbildning, the difference between various Christian communities would be less important if you emphasize the human side, right?
Yeah, but the interesting part there would be, my approach is not just as in ecumenical dialogues. I don't believe in those dialogues where we, in order to meet somebody, we kind of, we are entering into a diplomatic discourse where we try to be nice to somebody and then meet halfway in between. I believe in the approach which goes back to who we are, and we meet each other through who we are, not stepping outside of that. And I think that is what can be practiced within the Folkbildning framework or outside of it.
So you mean that you advocate the use of Folkbildning for a new ecumenical way?
Yeah, it could be used for all sorts of things. I focused here mostly on this, like its role or its potential role vis-a-vis the official educational system or the official university system, because I thought that would or might be of primary interest, but absolutely, I think it can be just used for developing our societies, to creating those citizens who won't be just citizens because they follow or fit in certain ideological framework of power structures, but because they dare to be free and be creative, and they are not afraid in that context of other human beings. So I think, it can be used for all sorts of things. Because if you develop human beings, that's part of the story. You don't develop them for a certain purpose. You develop them to be human beings. And how that will be manifested, you don't know. That's part of the game. Because then they can all of a sudden contribute. It's just like when you allow people to think freely within one discipline. When you do that, you all of a sudden, next generation or generation after that, completely changes the discipline. It's not the same discipline any longer. For a simple reason, because you allowed people to think let's use that awful phrase, outside of the box. So you allow them to, all of a sudden include their experience, their context. And then they all of a sudden say, well, actually this cup is not just a stupid cup there if you look at it from another perspective. And maybe then the cup is not our primary focus, but everything else. And that's more or less how all now interesting things that happen in human history occurred. By allowing people to be puzzled about simple things and try to find ways how to think about them in creative ways and bring their individual experiences and cultural context in a given framework, and that can be the framework of Folkbildning. It can be also university framework, but for structural reasons, probably it's more difficult to do it there, at least for now.